The wind wailed a song of pure grief across the northern plains. It was a sound that scraped the bone and promised an early, bitter winter. Inside the canvas cover of the swaying wagon, Evelyn Hart pulled her wool shawl tighter, the fine weave a flimsy defense against the vast, cold emptiness of the land. She had left Philadelphia with a trunk full of books, a heart full of scripture, and a naive belief that courage was a decision one made in the warmth of a parlor. Out here, she was learning courage was the simple act of drawing another breath against a wind that wanted to steal it from your lungs. Her fingers found the small brass bell tucked into a pocket of her traveling dress. Its clapper was muffled with a twist of cloth. It was a school bell, a promise of the life she intended to build in the raw new town of Red Bluff. A schoolhouse, no matter how humble, was a fortress against ignorance. It was a place where the children of this wild land could learn to read, to reason, to build a future that was not governed solely by the blast of a shotgun or the turn of a card. That was her purpose, the reason she had endured weeks of jolting travel and the endless, lonely sky. The lead driver, a man named Miller with a tobacco-stained beard, had assured them they were only a day from Red Bluff. They were following the shallow, ice-rimmed Powder River, a silver thread in a brown and gray tapestry. The promise of a solid roof and a hot meal was a powerful tonic, and a quiet optimism had settled over the small train of 3 wagons. The optimism shattered with the first gunshot. It was not a single, clean crack, but a ragged volley that tore through the canvas and the cold air. Wood splintered. A man screamed, a sound cut brutally short. Evelyn was thrown from the hard bench as the wagon lurched violently and then tipped, the world turning into a nightmare of tumbling crates, shattering jars of preserves, and the terrified shrieks of the other woman in the wagon. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the savage yells of their attackers. Through a tear in the canvas, she saw them, horsemen, their faces smeared with crude streaks of paint, a few feathers tied haphazardly in their hair. They swarmed the wagons, their movements filled with a frenzied, wasteful violence. They were not taking supplies so much as destroying them, hacking open sacks of flour, smashing lanterns, and firing their rifles into the air with wild abandon. Evelyn scrambled for cover behind her overturned trunk, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The small bell slipped from her pocket and rolled under the edge of the canvas, coming to rest in the frozen mud. This was it. This was the terror she had been warned about in hushed, thrilling tones back east. Savages. But something was wrong. Through the panic, a part of her mind, the part that had spent years observing, teaching, and tending to the sick, registered details that did not fit the stories. Their yells were guttural, but the words underneath were English, coarse and profane. The rifle fire was continuous, a staggering waste of ammunition. And one of the attackers, dismounted and kicking apart a crate of tools, wore heavy, square-toed boots, army-issue boots, like the ones the soldiers wore at the last fort they had passed. The chaos subsided as quickly as it had begun. The riders galloped away, their whoops fading into the ceaseless moan of the wind. A terrible silence descended, broken only by the crackle of a burning wagon and the low, agonized groan of a wounded man. Cold, a far more patient killer than any bullet, began to seep into Evelyn's bones. She crawled from the wreckage, her dress torn, her hands numb. The scene was one of utter devastation. Bodies lay still and broken on the frozen ground. Miller, the driver, was slumped over the front of his wagon, his life staining the weathered wood a dark, terrible red. She was alone. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The other passengers were gone, either dead or fled into a wilderness that would surely kill them. Panic gave way to a chilling, clear-headed despair. She would die here. She would freeze before the sun set, another forgotten victim of this brutal country. Evelyn stumbled towards a small copse of pine trees that offered a sliver of shelter from the wind. Her movements clumsy, her thoughts beginning to blur at the edges. She collapsed at the base of a gnarled pine, pulling her shawl around her. the thin wool offering no comfort at all. The world began to grow dim, the lament of the wind turning into a gentle, deadly lullaby. Chaska had been tracking a lone elk for 2 days, moving with a patience learned from a lifetime of reading the land. He was a man made of the very elements that were now threatening to kill the woman he did not yet know existed. The wind was his brother, the snow his confidant. The distant, scattered pops of gunfire had reached him first, a discordant sound that had no place in the natural rhythm of things. It was too much, too fast, not a hunt, a slaughter. He moved toward the sound, silent as a shadow, his moccasins making no sound on the pine-needle floor of the forest. He crested a low ridge and saw the smoke, a greasy black plume against the pearl-gray sky. His hand rested on the stock of his Winchester, his eyes scanning, missing nothing. He saw the ruined wagons, the bodies, the unnatural stillness. He crept closer, his gaze sweeping the scene, deciphering the story left in the snow and mud. His nose wrinkled in disgust. The tracks were a mess, the shod hoofprints of American horses, not the unshod ponies of his people. He knelt, his gloved fingers tracing the distinct tread of army boots pressed deep into the earth. Near one of the bodies, glinting in the weak afternoon light, lay a handful of spent cartridges. He picked one up, a .44 caliber shell, from a pistol or a repeating rifle, the kind favored by cowboys and soldiers. Any Lakota war party would have been armed with a mix of old trade muskets, bows, and a few stolen Springfields. They would have taken the horses, the food, the weapons. They would not have left such a wasteful, chaotic mess. This was a lie, a performance, staged for an unseen audience. He knew, with a cold certainty that settled deep in his gut, who the intended audience was: the good, God-fearing people of Red Bluff. He knew the story that would be told: a savage Lakota attack, a massacre of innocents. It was the oldest, dirtiest lie the white man told, and it always ended the same way, with more land stolen, more treaties broken, more of his people pushed toward starvation. His eyes caught a flicker of movement near the pines, a patch of dark blue wool, almost lost against the deep shadows. He approached with the caution of a wolf, his rifle ready. He found her curled at the base of a tree, her face pale as the snow, her breathing shallow. A white woman. He could see the fine quality of her clothes, the softness of her skin, untouched by the sun and wind that had carved his own features. Trouble. She was nothing but trouble. His first instinct was to leave her. Getting involved was a fool's errand. They would blame him for this anyway. Finding him with a survivor, a white woman, would only seal his fate. But his mother had not raised a man who left women to die in the snow. He knelt beside her, gently shaking her shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open, wide with a terror that struck him more deeply than any anger. She saw his long, dark hair, his buckskin clothing, his Lakota face, and she flinched away, a small, choked cry escaping her lips. "Do not be afraid," he said, his voice low and calm. The English words felt foreign on his tongue. She stared at him, her fear warring with a creeping numbness. He was not yelling, he was not threatening. He was simply watching her, his dark eyes holding a deep, unreadable sorrow. "You will die if you stay here," he said, his voice firm. He pulled off his own heavy buffalo hide cloak and wrapped it around her. The warmth was immediate, startling. It smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something else, something wild and clean. He worked with an efficient grace, checking her for injuries, his touch surprisingly gentle. He saw she was not wounded, just succumbing to the cold. He built a fire with a speed that seemed like magic to Evelyn's fading consciousness. Using dry kindling he produced from within his coat. As the flames grew, chasing the shadows and the worst of the cold, he helped her closer. He gave her water from a skin and a piece of dried meat that was tough but nourishing. He said little, but his presence was a solid, reassuring thing in a world that had come completely undone. As warmth returned to her body, clarity returned to her mind. She watched him as he moved back to the wreckage of the wagons, studying the tracks, his focus intense. He was not a savage. He was a hunter, a reader of signs, and he was piecing together the truth. He returned a few moments later, his expression grim. In his hand, he held the small brass school bell. He had seen it half buried in the mud. He held it out to her. "This is yours." Evelyn took it, her fingers curling around the cold metal. It felt impossibly heavy, a relic from a life that no longer seemed real. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "A rider went south," Chaska said, looking towards the horizon, fast, to tell the story. "What story?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "That the Lakota did this," he said, his gesture taking in the entire scene of carnage. "They will come from Red Bluff with ropes and rifles. They will hunt my people." The injustice of it was a bitter pill. These men, her people, had committed this atrocity and would now use it as an excuse to commit another. "But that is not true," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I saw them. They were white men, in disguise." Chaska nodded slowly. He had known it, but to hear her confirm it settled the matter. "Your words are the truth, but their ears are not open to the truth from a Lakota." He looked at her, his gaze direct. "They may listen to you." A new kind of fear, colder than any winter wind, touched Evelyn's heart. He was asking her to speak out, to stand against the men who ran the town she had hoped to call home, to defend a man her society had already judged and condemned. But then she looked at the bodies of the people she had traveled with, and she looked at the quiet dignity of the man who had just saved her life. Her purpose in coming west had been to build something good in a hard place. Perhaps this was the first lesson. Chaska saw the resolve harden in her eyes. He had a choice. He could take her to his people, to the winter camp of his relatives. They would protect her, but her presence would bring the soldiers and more conflict. Or he could take her to Red Bluff, into the center of the lie, into the heart of the danger. It was a terrible risk. They might hang him before she even had a chance to speak. But the truth was a weapon, and right now, she was the only one who could wield it. "The town is a day's journey," he said. "We must leave before the snow buries the trail." Evelyn gathered the heavy buffalo cloak around her. She looked at the smoldering wagons, a funeral pyre for the life she had imagined. Then she looked at the Lakota man, a stranger who now held her life and perhaps the lives of many others in his hands. She stood up on shaky legs, her decision made. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady in the mournful wind. "Let us go to Red Bluff." Red Bluff was less a town and more an open wound on the landscape. A single wide street of churned mud separated two rows of false-fronted buildings that leaned against each other for support. The wind, funneled between them, carried the scent of wet horses, stale beer, and a simmering, collective anger. As Chaska and Evelyn walked into the town, a silence fell over the street. Doors closed softly. Faces appeared in dusty windows. Men stopped their conversations to turn and stare, their expressions hardening into masks of suspicion and hate. The lone rider had arrived first, his story spreading like a prairie fire. A man wearing a tarnished star on his coat stepped off the boardwalk of the saloon. He was thick-set, with a florid face and small, predatory eyes. He walked with a swagger that was meant to project authority but only conveyed arrogance. Behind him, leaning against a support post, a younger, leaner man watched with an unnerving stillness. His hand never strayed far from the Colt revolver tied low on his hip. The man with the star spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the mud, narrowly missing Chaska's moccasin. "Well, look what the wind blew in," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Figured we would have to hunt you down. Saves us the trouble." "This man saved my life. Marshall," Evelyn said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. She would not let them see her fear. "There was an attack on our wagon train." The marshal, Pike, gave her a dismissive glance. "We heard all about it, ma'am. A real tragedy. Another Indian massacre." "It was not," Evelyn insisted, stepping forward. "The attackers were white men. They were disguised." Pike chuckled. a humorless, ugly sound. "Ma'am, you must have been terrified, cold, scared. It is easy to get confused in a situation like that." He looked past her to Chaska, his eyes narrowing. He was at the scene. Was he not funny how they always are? Like buzzards to a carcass. "He found me after he helped me," she pleaded. "He is coming with me," Pike said, his hand dropping to his own pistol, "for his own protection. Of course. We will get this all sorted out. Cole, escort the lady to the hotel. See that she is comfortable." The lean man, Cole Maddox, pushed himself off the post and moved toward Evelyn. He did not touch her, but his presence was a physical threat, a promise of violence held in reserve. Chaska gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a signal for her not to resist. He met Pike's gaze without flinching as the marshal produced a pair of iron cuffs. "There is no need for that," Chaska said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made Pike pause. "I will not run." They put him in a small, foul-smelling cell at the back of the marshal's office. It had a single barred window that looked out onto a muddy alley and a new, raw pine gallows. A rope, already coiled into a hangman's noose, dangled from the crossbeam, swaying gently in the wind. A message, plain and simple. Cole Maddox left Evelyn at the door of the Red Bluff Grand Hotel, a two-story structure that was grand only in name. The lobby was quiet, watched over by a nervous clerk. A man sitting in a leather armchair by the cold fireplace rose as she entered. He was impeccably dressed in a dark wool suit, his silver hair neatly combed, his hands clean and soft. He looked utterly out of place in the rough town, yet he radiated an aura of absolute control. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, "a terrible ordeal you have endured. I am Silas Boone. I suppose you could say I have a significant interest in the prosperity and good order of this community." He guided her to a chair, his manner a perfect blend of concern and command. He listened patiently as she recounted her story, her words tumbling out in a rush of indignation and fear. She told him about the army boots, the wasted ammunition, the English curses. He nodded sympathetically, his expression never changing. "A truly harrowing account," he said when she finished. "It is a blessing you were not harmed further. However, you must understand the sensitivities here. The railroad is coming through. Progress. It brings opportunity. But it also creates friction. People are on edge. A story like yours, well, it could be seen as inflammatory, divisive. It is the truth," Evelyn stated plainly. "Truth," Boone mused, steepling his fingers. "Truth is a matter of perspective. Miss Hart, the perspective of this town is that they are surrounded by a hostile, savage element that threatens their very existence. What they need is security. What they need is a clear enemy." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "I understand you came here to build a school, a noble ambition, an endeavor that requires lumber, books, a salary for the teacher. It requires funding. I am in a position to provide such funding. I could have a schoolhouse built for you before the first serious snow." The offer hung in the air between them, ugly and tempting. All he was asking for was her silence. All he wanted was for her to let the lie stand, to let an innocent man hang, and in return, she would get the one thing she had traveled 2,000 miles to create. "My school will not be built on a foundation of lies and blood," she said, her voice shaking with a cold fury. "Mr. Boone, I will tell the truth." Silas Boone's polite smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold as ice. "A pity," he said softly. "It seems you have not yet learned how things work in the West. Miss Hart, I do hope you learn quickly. It can be a very unforgiving place for slow students." The hearing was held the next morning in the saloon. The air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies. Marshal Pike sat behind a poker table, a gavel in his hand, a mockery of justice. Silas Boone stood near the bar, observing, a silent king in his court. The room was packed with grim-faced men, their hands resting on the pistols at their belts. Evelyn felt 100 pairs of eyes on her as she was called to speak. She told her story again, trying to keep her voice even, focusing on the facts, The boots, the cartridges, the voices. Pike listened, a sneer playing on his lips. "So you are saying," he began when she was done, his voice dripping with condescension, "that you, a lady from back east, fresh off the wagon, can tell the difference between a military boot and a regular one from a distance, in the middle of a terrifying attack?" "I was a volunteer nurse during the war," she countered. "I saw more army boots than I can count." "And you heard English? Are you telling this court that the Sioux do not know a single curse word in our tongue? I find that hard to believe." Laughter rumbled through the room. Her testimony was being dismantled, her credibility shredded. They twisted her words, painting her as a hysterical woman, easily manipulated by the cunning savage who had found her. They made Chaska out to be the mastermind, a scout for the war party who stayed behind to play the hero and throw them off the scent. It was a fiction, a grotesque and hateful play, and she was the unwilling star. When she was done, Pike banged his gavel. "The witness is clearly overwrought," he declared. "Given the suspicious circumstances and for the safety of this town, I am holding the Indian Chaska on suspicion of murder and conspiracy. He will be held until a circuit judge can be summoned. Case closed." A roar of approval went up from the crowd. It was a death sentence. No circuit judge was coming. They would form a mob tonight, or tomorrow, and drag Chaska to the gallows. Justice in Red Bluff was swift, and it was thirsty. As Evelyn was pushed aside, her heart heavy with failure, she saw a new sign, freshly painted, nailed to a post outside the marshal's office, in bold black letters. It read, "Railroad right-of-way. Survey in progress." It was planted directly in a patch of ground dotted with low, weathered stones and burial mounds, a place she now understood was a sacred cemetery. That afternoon, as despair settled over her, there was a quiet knock at her hotel room door. It was an old man in the black, worn cassock of a priest. His face was a road map of wrinkles, his eyes a pale, watery blue, but they held a gentle light. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice a soft Irish brogue. "I am Father Malloy. May I have a word?" He had heard the commotion, the verdict of the saloon court. He had also been out to the site of the attack, not to look for clues, but to say a prayer for the dead. While he was there, his conscience had compelled him to look closer. "Men in a hurry are often careless," he told her, his old hands trembling slightly as he opened a small leather pouch. He emptied its contents onto the small table. "A dozen or so spent cartridges. These were all I could find, but I think you will find them interesting." Evelyn picked one up. It was heavy, brassy. "That is a 45-70 government," Father Malloy said softly. "Fired from a military-issue Springfield rifle. Not a weapon the Lakota are likely to have in any great number. And this one," he pointed to another, smaller shell, "is a 44-40 Winchester, from a repeating rifle. The very weapons Pike, Maddox, and Boone's ranch hands all carry." Hope, fierce and fragile, flared in Evelyn's chest. It was proof, tangible, undeniable proof. The mob formed just after dusk, fueled by whiskey and self-righteous fury. A crowd of men surged toward the marshal's office, torches held high, casting flickering demonic shadows against the town's buildings. "Bring him out," they roared. "Let us have justice." Marshal Pike stood on the steps, holding up his hands for quiet, a grim smile on his face. "Now, boys, we have to do this proper. But I cannot say I disagree with the sentiment." They were dragging Chaska out of his cell, his hands bound. He did not struggle. His face was a mask of calm defiance, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the hate-filled faces of the crowd. They threw a rope over the gallows beam. Just as the noose was about to be settled around his neck, Father Malloy stepped out from the crowd, holding up a simple wooden cross. "Stop," he cried, his old voice cracking but filled with a sudden, thunderous authority. "You will not commit murder in the sight of God this night." The mob faltered, surprised by the priest's intervention. "This is justice, Father, not murder," a man shouted. "Is it justice to hang a man based on a lie?" Father Malloy retorted. He held up one of the cartridges. "This bullet was found at the massacre, a government-issue bullet, not from a Lakota bow." He threw the cartridge on the ground before Pike. The marshal stared at it, his face paling slightly, Evelyn pushed her way through the stunned crowd to stand beside the priest. Her fear was gone, replaced by a white-hot clarity. She looked directly at Silas Boone, who was watching from the hotel balcony, his perfect composure finally cracking. "I was there," Evelyn's voice rang out, clear and strong, silencing the murmurs. "I saw them. They were not Lakota. They were white men, hired by cowards who want this land and will stop at nothing to get it. This man, Chaska, is innocent. He saved my life. If you hang him, you are not men of justice. You are murderers, every one of you." A stunned silence fell over the square. The men looked from Evelyn's passionate, truthful face to the priest's unwavering stand, and then to the suddenly nervous Marshal Pike. The fervor of the mob began to curdle into uncertainty and shame. Pike, seeing the mood turn against him, cursed under his breath. He had no choice. To proceed would be to expose himself. "Cut him down!" he snarled at one of his deputies. The rope was removed from Chaska's neck. He was shoved forward, free but not safe. The crowd began to disperse, melting back into the shadows, unwilling to meet Evelyn's gaze. Chaska walked over to her, his dark eyes holding a new light of respect. And something more. He was free, for now. But as he and Evelyn stood with the old priest in the suddenly empty square, they could feel the cold, hateful eyes of Silas Boone, Marshal Pike, and Cole Maddox watching them from the darkness. They had won the moment, but they had just declared themselves the primary targets in a war for the soul of Red Bluff. The dawn that followed their victory was gray and silent, the air holding the cold, brittle tension of a drawn bowstring. Red Bluff was quiet, but it was the quiet of a predator gathering itself to spring. Father Malloy met them in the weak light outside the hotel, his face etched with worry. He pressed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle into Evelyn's hands. It contained a loaf of dense bread, a piece of hard cheese, and a handful of dried apples. "You cannot stay here," the old priest said, his voice barely a whisper. "Boone's pride has been wounded. He will not let it stand. He owns the law in this town, and when the law fails him, he has men like Maddox who operate outside of it." Chaska nodded, his eyes scanning the street, the rooftops, the dark alleyways. He had not slept. He had watched the town from the shadows, feeling its ugly mood shift and curdle. "We will go," he said. "There is a place in the hills, an old hunter's cabin. We can wait there until their anger cools." "It will not cool," Father Malloy said grimly. "It will only fester. Be careful, my children." He placed a hand on each of their shoulders, a brief, trembling blessing. "The truth has a hard road in this land, but it is the only one worth walking." They slipped out of town as the first rays of sun touched the distant peaks, moving north, away from the river, into the broken country of pine-clad hills and deep ravines. Chaska led them on a path that was no path at all, a route known only to him and the deer, designed to leave as little trace as possible. He walked with an easy, ground-covering stride, while Evelyn struggled to keep up, the heavy buffalo cloak cumbersome, her city-bred muscles aching in protest. Yet she did not complain. She watched him, learning. She saw how he tested the wind, how his eyes were always moving, reading the story of a bent twig, a disturbed patch of frost, a distant flock of birds taking flight. He was as much a part of this wilderness as the stones and the trees. By midday, the sky had lost its color, becoming a flat, oppressive sheet of white. The wind picked up, biting at their exposed skin, and the air grew thick with a strange, heavy silence. The birds were gone. The world seemed to be holding its breath. "A storm is coming," Chaska said, stopping to look at the sky. A bad one. Evelyn could feel it now, a change in the pressure of the air, a deep and menacing hum that resonated in her bones. "How can you be so sure?" "The sky gives warnings, if you know how to listen," he replied simply. "We must find shelter, now." He quickened his pace, his movements becoming more urgent. He led her into a narrow canyon, the rock walls offering some protection from the rising wind. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a hard, horizontal spray that stung her face and blinded her. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat. She could no longer see more than a few feet in front of her. She was utterly dependent on the man whose dark shape moved steadily ahead. She trusted him. The realization was as simple and profound as the storm itself. Just as her strength was beginning to fail, he stopped before a dark shape huddled against the canyon wall. It was a small cabin, barely more than a shack, built of rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud. Its roof was collapsing on one side, but it was 4 walls and a chance at survival. Chaska pushed open the heavy, creaking door and ushered her inside. The interior was dark and smelled of damp earth and old smoke. It contained nothing but a crude stone fireplace, a broken stool, and a pile of rotting furs in one corner. But it was a refuge from the screaming wind. While Chaska worked to barricade the door against the storm with fallen timbers, Evelyn knelt at the hearth. She cleared away the old ashes with numb fingers, her mind focused on this one small, essential task. Chaska brought in an armload of pine branches he had gathered from under a sheltering rock overhang, with his flint and steel and a bit of dry moss from his tinder pouch. He coaxed a tiny spark into a flame. He fed it splinters of wood, then larger pieces, until a cheerful, crackling fire pushed back the gloom and the soul deep cold. The warmth on Evelyn's face was the most wonderful sensation she had ever known. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the flames, listening to the blizzard rage outside. The storm cut them off from the world, enclosing them in a small, fragile bubble of warmth and light. The town of Red Bluff, Silas Boone, the lie they were fighting, all of it seemed to belong to another lifetime. Here, there was only the fire, the storm, and the two of them. Evelyn unpacked the meager provisions from Father Malloy. She broke the bread in half and gave the larger piece to Chaska. He accepted it with a quiet nod. They ate slowly, savoring each mouthful. It was a communion, a sharing of sustenance that went deeper than mere words. As the evening wore on, the confines of the small cabin seemed to press them closer. Evelyn found herself studying Chaska in the flickering firelight. His face, which had at first seemed a stoic, unreadable mask, now showed a geography of experience. She saw the fine lines around his eyes, earned from years of squinting into the sun. She saw the firm set of his jaw, a testament to a resilience she was only beginning to understand. She felt a question rising in her, a desire to know the man, not just the savior. "Where did you learn to speak English so well?" she asked, her voice soft in the quiet space. He looked up from the knife he was sharpening. "My mother learned it at the mission school, before she understood it was a place for taking things, not giving them. She taught me. She said it was a weapon, like a knife or a bow. She said one day I might need it to protect our people." He fell silent, his eyes distant, lost in a memory. She believed words could be a bridge. I think she was wrong. They are only another kind of wall. Evelyn thought of her books, her dream of a school. Were they just another wall? Sometimes they can be, she admitted. But they can also be a window, a way to see into another person's world. She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out the small brass bell. She had tied a piece of leather cord to it. She hung it from a wooden peg on the wall near the fireplace, where the firelight caught the polished metal. It did not ring, but its presence was a quiet statement. "This is my world." Chaska watched her. He did not speak, but after a moment, he reached into his own leather pack and drew out a small, flat object. It was a hand drum, its surface painted with the image of a bison running across a sunlit plain. He set it carefully on the packed earth floor, leaning it against his pack. He did not play it, but it sat there, a counterpart to her bell. My world. The two objects, one representing the ordered call to learning, the other the heartbeat of an ancient culture, shared the small, warm space by the fire. A profound question began to form in Evelyn's mind. She had left her home, her entire world, to come to this place. She had arrived with a clear sense of purpose, a firm idea of who she was and what she was meant to do. Now, all of it was in question. She was a fugitive, hiding from the very civilization she had come to serve, protected by a man that civilization wanted to destroy. Where, in all this, did she truly belong? Was she the Eastern teacher, or was she becoming something else, someone forged by the fire and the storm? Chaska, too, was lost in his own thoughts. This woman was a complication he could not afford. His duty was to his family, to his people who were camped in the Winter Valley a few days' journey from here. They were depending on him for meat, for scouting, for news of the white man's movements. By protecting her, he was drawing Boone's attention, not just to himself, but to anyone associated with him. Yet, when he looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, at the determined set of her chin as she hung that ridiculous little bell, he could not bring himself to regret his choice. She had stood for him. She had spoken the truth when it would have been so much easier, so much safer, to remain silent. His mother had spoken of bridges. Perhaps, he thought, a bridge required a strong anchor on both sides of the canyon. The storm howled for 2 days. They fell into a quiet routine dictated by the necessities of survival. Chaska would venture out into the white chaos to gather more wood, his form disappearing almost instantly. Evelyn would feel a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest until he returned, covered in snow, his presence a reassurance. He taught her how to set snares near the cabin, and on the second morning, they were rewarded with 2 snowshoe hares. He showed her how to skin and cook them, a practical, unsentimental lesson in the reality of life and death in the wilderness. He conserved his ammunition, knowing each cartridge might be the one that stood between them and starvation, or between them and Cole Maddox's gun. She learned to melt snow for water, to bank the fire at night so a bed of hot coals remained in the morning. They spoke little, but a language of shared tasks and mutual reliance grew between them. On the 3rd morning, they awoke to silence. The wind had died. The world outside the cabin was a fresh, brilliant white, sculpted by the storm into beautiful alien shapes. The air was clean and cold, and the sun on the new snow was dazzling. They prepared to leave, packing the leftover food, Chaska cleaning his rifle with meticulous care. As they set out, the land was transformed. It was a pristine, unbroken wilderness, but Chaska's eyes were sharp. He pointed to a line of freshly painted wooden stakes driven into the snow, marking a path through the valley. "The railroad survey," he said, his voice hard. They followed the line of stakes for a mile, a garish scar on the perfect snow. Then Chaska stopped dead. He stared at a place where the snow had been disturbed not just by the surveyors, but by heavier work. Earth and rock had been overturned, piled into a low, long embankment, the beginnings of a bed for the iron rails. Lying half-buried in the piles of displaced dirt were several large, flat stones. They were not random rocks. They were weathered and gray, some bearing the faint, carved symbols of the wind, the sun, and the buffalo. Evelyn looked at them, confused. What are they? A deep, cold anger, more fearsome than the blizzard, settled over Chaska's face. He walked to one of the stones and brushed the snow from it with his hand, his touch reverent, full of pain. "They are the markers," he said, his voice thick with a grief that spanned generations. "This is the valley of my ancestors. This is sacred ground." He looked at her, his dark eyes burning with the awful truth. "This is not just about the land. Evelyn, Boone is not just trying to build a railroad. He is trying to erase us. He is digging up our graves." The journey away from the desecrated graves was a silent one. Chaska moved with a grim purpose, the grief of his people a cold, hard weight in his chest. He had made a choice. To run from Boone's evil was to let it triumph. To fight it with violence would bring soldiers and death to his family. There was only one path left, as narrow and dangerous as a cliff edge in a blizzard. He had to take Evelyn to the one place he had sworn to protect from the outside world. He explained it to her in a low voice as they walked, the sun glinting off the endless snow. He said that hiding in the hills was no longer enough. The stakes Boone had driven into the ground were a declaration of war, and a war fought with lies had to be met with truth. His people, he said, must hear her story from her own lips. They had to understand the nature of the enemy they faced. Evelyn was exhausted, her body aching, but she understood the gravity of his decision. He was trusting her not just with his life, but with the location of his family, his community. It was a burden and an honor that settled over her with a solemn weight. For 2 days they traveled deeper into the hills, following frozen creek beds and ridges that kept them hidden from the open plains. The world grew wilder, more beautiful. She saw the tracks of mountain lions, the soaring flight of a golden eagle. This was his home, and she felt like an intruder, a ghost from another world. Late on the second afternoon, they came to a place where the canyon walls narrowed. Chaska stopped and pointed to a thick stand of ancient, snow-laden pine trees that seemed to grow right out of the rock face. He led her through them, and the world opened up. It was a hidden valley, a perfect bowl protected on all sides by high, impassable cliffs. Smoke curled from the tops of a dozen buffalo-hide teepees nestled in a grove of cottonwoods near a steaming, spring-fed creek. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat. Horses grazed peacefully in a makeshift corral. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary that felt 1,000 miles and 100 years away from the raw wound of Red Bluff. As they descended into the camp, a hush fell. Women who were scraping hides stopped their work, their bone tools held motionless. Old men smoking their pipes by the fires turned to watch them. Children, who had been playing a noisy game with a ball, fell silent and ran to hide behind their mothers. A deep, collective suspicion met them like a physical wall. This was a place for the people. She was not one of them. Chaska did not falter. He led her past the watching eyes toward the largest teepee, which stood slightly apart from the others. An older woman was working outside, stretching a deer hide on a wooden frame. Her hair was graying, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, and her eyes were as sharp and intelligent as a hawk's. She looked from Chaska to Evelyn, and her expression was a mixture of love for her nephew and profound mistrust for the woman he had brought with him. Chaska spoke to her in the flowing, musical tones of the Lakota language. He called her Ampo, his aunt. She replied in short, sharp questions, her gaze never leaving Evelyn. From a flap in the teepee, an old man emerged. He was stooped with age, but his presence was immense. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that needed no badge or gavel to announce his authority. This was Redleaf, the elder. Again. Chaska spoke, his voice respectful, explaining the attack on the wagons, the events in Red Bluff, and the desecration of the burial ground during the long telling. Evelyn stood silently, her hands clasped before her, feeling the full weight of their stares. She was the cause of this disturbance, the foreign object in this perfectly balanced world. A group of younger men had gathered, their faces hard, their arms crossed over their chests. One of them, his hair cut short in a sign of mourning for a past battle, stepped forward and spoke, his words a sharp, angry torrent directed at Chaska. He gestured toward Evelyn. Chaska listened patiently before replying, his own voice low and steady, refusing to be drawn into anger. The young warrior was not satisfied. He spat on the ground and turned away, followed by several others. Later, as Ampo grudgingly gave Evelyn a bowl of hot bison stew, Chaska explained, the young warrior was named Matto. His father had been killed at the greasy grass, and his heart was full of hate for all white people. He said Evelyn was a trick, a lure to bring the soldiers to their winter camp. He wanted Chaska to return her to Red Bluff, to leave her to her fate and protect their own. Evelyn's heart sank. She understood Matto's fear and his hatred. What had her people ever done to earn his trust? Chaska told her what he had replied. He had told Matto and the elders that fear was a prison. He said this white woman had a strong heart. She had stood for him when her own people wanted his blood. She was a witness. Her words, her truth, were their only hope of fighting Boone without a war they could not win. Redleaf had listened to all of it, his ancient eyes seeming to look straight into Evelyn's soul. He had made his decision. She could remain, for now. The days that followed were a quiet and profound education. Evelyn set aside the woman she had been and tried to become a useful guest. She watched Ampo prepare pemmican, the life-sustaining food of the plains, with a heavy stone. The older woman pounded strips of dried bison meat into a fine powder, then mixed it with hot, rendered fat and dried chokecherries. She offered the stone to Evelyn. At first, her movements were clumsy, her arms weak, but she persisted, pounding the meat until her shoulders burned, determined to contribute, not just consume. Ampo watched her efforts without comment, but one afternoon she left a beautifully beaded awl and a piece of sinew by Evelyn's sleeping robes, a silent acknowledgement of her effort. In the evenings, she would sit near the fire in Redleaf's teepee and listen. He would tell stories to the children, his voice a mesmerizing rhythm. He spoke of the Bison Nation, who willingly gave themselves to the Lakota so they could live, and of the sacred fields where the spirits of the ancestors dwelled. His stories were not simple fables. They were lessons in respect, balance, and the interconnectedness of all living things. Evelyn realized that her trunk full of books in the ruined wagon contained one kind of knowledge, but here, in this teepee, was a library of wisdom thousands of years old. Her medical skills, however, were what finally began to build a true bridge. A young child, a boy of about 5, fell ill. He was burning with a fever that would not break, and a rattling cough shook his small body. The medicine man had chanted his prayers and administered his herbal remedies, but the boy only grew weaker. The child's mother sat by his side, her face a mask of anguish, a low, constant moan coming from her lips. Evelyn recognized the sound of the cough. It was the lung fever she had seen take so many soldiers in the damp, crowded hospitals during the war. She approached Chaska. She said she might be able to help. She explained that sometimes steam could loosen the sickness in the chest. It was a huge risk. If the child died after she interfered, she would be blamed. Maddo and his followers would have all the reason they needed to cast her out. But she could not stand by and do nothing. Chaska took her to Ampo and the boy's mother. He explained what Evelyn wanted to do. The mother, desperate, looked from Evelyn's earnest face to her son's labored breathing and nodded her consent. Working with Ampo, Evelyn boiled water over the fire, filling the teepee with a thick, warm steam. She gently held the boy, his head over the rising vapor, speaking to him in a soft, soothing voice. She had Ampo soak cloths in cool water from the creek and placed them on the child's forehead and neck, working tirelessly to bring the fever down. She did not sleep, staying by his side all night, coaxing him to sip a little willow bark tea that Ampo had brewed. Toward dawn, a change occurred. The boy's breathing became less ragged. The fire in his skin began to cool. He coughed, a deep, productive sound this time, and then fell into a true healing sleep. The next morning, when he was able to sit up and drink a little broth, his mother came to Evelyn. She did not speak English, but she took Evelyn's hands in her own and pressed her forehead to them, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. Ampo brought her a bowl of the best broth and watched her eat, a look of undeniable respect in her sharp eyes. From that day on, the camp's suspicion began to melt away, replaced by a cautious acceptance. She was no longer just the white woman. She was the woman who had healed the child. A few days later, 2 scouts rode hard into camp, their horses steaming in the cold air. They went directly to Redleaf's teepee. A council of elders and warriors was called. Chaska was among them. The meeting lasted for hours. When he finally came to find Evelyn, his face was grim. The news was what they had feared. Silas Boone was not waiting for the ground to thaw. A large survey crew, more than 20 men, was already on its way into the Valley of the Ancestors, and they were not coming alone. Boone had hired a dozen men from the Pinkerton Detective Agency to ride guard, professional gunmen with no conscience and a loyalty only to the man who paid them. Chaska stood before her, the fate of his people reflected in his dark, troubled eyes. The time for hiding was over. The choice had come. He said that Redleaf and the council were debating what to do. They could pack up the camp and flee, deeper into the mountains, abandoning the sacred graves to the shovels and plows of the railroad, or they could stand, Not to fight a battle of guns, which they would surely lose, but to fight a battle of justice. It was a choice between survival and honor, between running and facing the truth. The council in Redleaf's tipi was a circle of grim faces illuminated by the flickering fire. The scouts' report lay in the center of their thoughts like a heavy stone. Matto, the young warrior, spoke with a voice hot with anger. He argued for war. He said they should strike the survey crew, drive them out with arrows and rifles, and show the white man that Lakota land could not be taken without a blood price. He said fighting was the only honorable path. When he had finished, a heavy silence filled the teepee. Then Chaska spoke. His voice was quiet, but it commanded the attention of every man present. He did not speak of honor or of war. He spoke of survival. He said a fight would bring the army, hundreds of soldiers, maybe thousands. It would be a fight they could not win. It would mean the end of their winter camp, the end of their safety. "Boone wants us to fight," Chaska said, his gaze meeting Matto's. "He wants us to give him an excuse to call us murderers. He has built his entire plan on a lie. We cannot defeat his lie with arrows. We must defeat it with a truth so loud it cannot be ignored." He then laid out his own plan, a hunter's plan, not a warrior's. It was a plan of patience and precision. He spoke of the Pinkerton men, guards hired for money, not for a cause. Their loyalty was thin. He proposed that he and Evelyn would leave the camp, track the survey crew, and find a way to isolate and capture one of these hired guns. They would not kill him. They would make him talk. Evelyn, who had been asked to wait just outside the teepee flap, was brought in. Redleaf looked at her, his ancient eyes weighing her spirit. Chaska explained her part. She would be the scribe. Her knowledge of the white man's words and writing would be their weapon. She would record the man's confession, a written testimony. He argued, was a powerful thing in the white man's world. It was a piece of paper that could stop a railroad. Matto scoffed at the idea. He called it a coward's plan, trusting a woman and a piece of paper over the strength of a warrior's arm. But the older men, Redleaf among them, listened with thoughtful gravity. They had seen too many wars, too many broken treaties. They knew the cost of a fight and the power of the white man's laws when they were twisted against them. Perhaps, they reasoned, those same laws could be made to serve the truth. Redleaf finally gave his consent. He told Chaska to take what he needed. He told Evelyn to be strong. He said their path was a dangerous one, but it was a path of wisdom. As they left the council, Matto watched them, his face a mask of contempt. He believed they were leading his people to ruin. Their departure from the hidden valley was quiet and swift. Ampo pressed a pouch of pemmican and healing herbs into Evelyn's hands, her touch a silent prayer for their safety. Chaska carried his Winchester, a long coil of rope, and an extra blanket. Evelyn carried her precious journal and a pencil, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect them from the elements. They moved like ghosts out of the sanctuary and back into the harsh, contested world. Chaska knew the land, and he knew the route the survey crew would most likely take. It led through a narrow, steep-walled canyon known as Cougar's Leap, a place where a rock slide a generation ago had created a treacherous bottleneck. It was a natural trap. For 2 days they traveled hard and fast, circling around the crew's advance until they were positioned high on the canyon rim, hidden among a jumble of massive boulders. From their perch, they watched the party enter the canyon below. There were nearly 30 men in all, a long, slow-moving line of surveyors with their tripods and chains, and the dozen Pinkerton men on horseback, their rifles held ready in their saddle scabbards. They were professionals, their eyes constantly scanning the canyon walls, their movements economical and alert. Capturing one would not be easy. Chaska had a plan. High above the trail, a section of the cliff face was unstable, a scree of loose rock held in place by a few key boulders. He pointed it out to Evelyn. He would dislodge it, not to bury the men, but to create chaos and separate the last rider from the group. She was to remain hidden, her role to come only after the capture was made. He moved away, climbing higher up the slope with the fluid grace of a mountain cat. Evelyn watched, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was a teacher, a nurse. Now she was a willing participant in an ambush, her life depending on the courage of a Lakota man and the simple laws of physics. She watched as Chaska positioned himself above the rockslide, using the stock of his rifle as a lever against a large, precariously balanced rock. Below, the last rider, a man with a thick neck and a mean set to his mouth, had reined in his horse to light a cigar. He was 20 yards behind the next man, isolated. It was the perfect moment. Chaska put his shoulder into the effort and the rock gave way. It was not a thunderous roar, but a dry, grinding cascade. Boulders and gravel poured down the cliffside, landing directly on the trail between the last rider and the rest of the party. The man's horse screamed and reared, terrified by the sudden noise and movement. The other men shouted in alarm, pulling their horses around, their rifles suddenly in their hands. In that instant of confusion, Chaska slid down the slope, landing almost silently on the trail behind the separated rider. "Drop the gun," he commanded, his Winchester leveled. The Pinkerton was a professional. He did not panic. He spun in his saddle, his own rifle coming up. He fired, the shot deafening in the narrow canyon. The bullet sparked off the rock face, inches from Chaska's head. Before the man could fire again, Chaska's rifle cracked once. It was not a killing shot. The bullet hit the man's rifle, splintering the wooden stock and tearing it from his grasp. The man cried out in pain as the impact jolted his arm. His horse, already panicked, bolted, running wildly back down the canyon, away from the main group. Evelyn watched in horror as two of the other Pinkertons spurred their horses, preparing to give chase. But Chaska was ready. He fired again, not at the men, but at the rock wall just above them. The bullet's impact sent a shower of stone chips down, forcing them to rein in and shield their faces. It was enough of a delay. Chaska was already on his feet, sprinting after the runaway horse. He vaulted onto a low ledge, ran along it, and launched himself through the air, tackling the Pinkerton rider clean out of the saddle. They hit the ground in a tangle of limbs. Chaska was faster. He had his knife at the man's throat before the Pinkerton could draw his sidearm. The fight was over in seconds. A bullet whined past Evelyn's head, kicking up a spray of snow from the rock she was hiding behind. The Pinkertons in the canyon had spotted her position. She flattened herself against the stone, her heart frozen with terror. Another shot struck the rock, and a piece of lead, flattened and hot, ricocheted. It tore through the heavy wool of her coat and shawl, searing a line of fire across her collarbone. She cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, and slumped against the boulder, the world suddenly gray at the edges. Chaska heard her cry. He tied the captured man's hands with a length of rawhide, his movements swift and efficient. He then half-dragged, half-carried the man off the trail, into the cover of the rocks where Evelyn was hidden. The other Pinkertons were advancing cautiously, unsure of how many attackers they faced. Evelyn was pale, her hand pressed against her shoulder, her fingers coming away bloody. Chaska's face hardened. He looked at her wound, a long, ugly graze, bleeding freely but not deep. She was alive. That was all that mattered. He turned his attention to their prisoner, who was watching them with wide, fearful eyes. "What is your name?" Chaska demanded. "Ames," the man gasped, his arm throbbing with pain. "Why are you here?" Ames Chaska asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Why does your boss desecrate our graves?" "The railroad," Ames stammered. "It is just for the railroad." Evelyn, ignoring the fire in her own shoulder, pulled her journal and pencil from her coat. She leaned against the rock, her hand shaking. "That is a lie," she said, her voice weak but clear. "The railroad could go south of here. There is another reason." She looked the man in the eye, her gaze a mixture of compassion and steel. "We will not kill you. I am a nurse. I can bind your arm, but you will tell us the truth." Something in her voice, in her promise of care even as she bled herself, seemed to break the man's will. He looked from her to Chaska's unforgiving face, and he saw the shots still being fired by his companions down the canyon. They were not trying to save him. They were trying to silence a threat. He was expendable. "Boone found it," Ames said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The old Spanish maps were right. It is not just the railroad. This whole valley, it is full of copper, a whole mountain of it. He aims to own it all. The attack on the wagon train, that was his idea. He paid us to dress up, make it look like a raid. He wanted an excuse to get the army in here, to drive your people out for good, before anyone else found out what was under the ground. Evelyn's pencil flew across the page, her hand trembling not just from pain, but from the enormity of the confession. It was all there. The motive, the conspiracy, the cold-blooded truth. A new sound began to mix with the sporadic gunfire, a low, rising moan. The wind, the sky, which had been clear, was turning a familiar, leaden gray. The blizzard was returning, faster and more furious than before. "We have to go," Chaska said. He ripped a strip of cloth from their captive's shirt and quickly made a sling for the man's arm, then gagged him securely. The gunfire from the canyon was fading, the Pinkertons likely falling back in the face of the worsening storm, but they would be back. He turned to Evelyn. She tried to stand but staggered, a wave of dizziness washing over her. The blood loss, the cold, and the shock were taking their toll. He saw the dark stain spreading on her dress. He ripped a piece from her shawl and pressed it hard against the wound. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, but he knew it was a lie. He put his arm around her, supporting most of her weight, and began to move, half carrying her away from the canyon, deeper into the maze of rocks. Their captive stumbled along beside them. The snow was coming down in a thick, blinding curtain, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they were made. The wind howled, a symphony of rage. Evelyn's strength gave out completely, her legs buckled, and she would have fallen if not for his strong grip. He did not hesitate. He lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against the strength of the storm. He pushed onward, his own breath pluming in the frigid air, his every step a battle against the wind and the deepening snow. He had to find shelter. He had to protect the woman who carried their only weapon, the truth, written in a shaking hand in a small, precious book. Just as the last of the light was failing, he saw it. A dark opening in the rock face, a shallow cave carved by the wind and time. It was not much, but it was a haven. He carried Evelyn inside, out of the screaming blizzard, and gently laid her down upon the cold stone floor. Her life, and their shared hope for justice, resting entirely in his hands. The cave was a shallow scoop in the rock, a stone mouth that offered meager protection from the blizzard's teeth. The wind did not just howl, it shrieked, a physical force that clawed at the entrance, trying to rip away the small pocket of stillness Chaska had found. He deposited their prisoner, Ames, in the deepest part of the recess, checking the knots on his wrists and adding another strip of rawhide to secure his ankles. He left the gag in place. The man was a tool, not a companion, and his silence was a blessing. Evelyn was a pale, huddled shape near the entrance, shivering uncontrollably. The makeshift bandage on her shoulder was a dark, frozen patch of cloth. Her face, illuminated by the swirling whiteness from outside, was drawn with pain and exhaustion. Life was slipping out of her with every tremor. Fire was life. Chaska worked with a desperate, focused energy. He used his knife to shave slivers from a piece of dry pine he carried for this exact purpose, sheltering the nascent flame with his own body. He blew on the spark, coaxing it, praying to the spirits of the air and the flame. When the fire finally caught, a tiny, defiant orange blossom in the gloom, he felt a measure of his own spirit return. He fed it greedily, building it into a robust blaze that pushed back the monstrous cold and painted the cave walls with dancing, golden light. He brought Evelyn closer to the warmth, propping her up against his pack. He gave her a piece of pemmican, but she could not eat. The firelight showed him the truth. The wound was worse than he had thought. The bleeding had slowed, but the cloth was frozen to her skin. It had to be cleaned. Now. Infection was a silent killer, as patient and deadly as the storm. He knelt before her, the firelight casting his face in sharp planes of shadow and light. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low and steady, trying to cut through the fog of her pain. "I must look at the wound. I have to clean it." She nodded weakly, her eyes clouded. She understood what he meant. The bullet had torn through her collarbone area. To reach it, her dress, her chemise, all the layers that were a lady's armor against the world, would have to be removed. In her world, a doctor might do such a thing. In a sterile room, with a curtain for privacy. Here, in a cave, with a Lakota man she had known for less than a week. It was an act of unthinkable intimacy. He saw the fear and shame that warred with the pain in her eyes. He expected a protest, a refusal. He would have understood, but he had underestimated the woman she was becoming. She looked at his face, at the honest concern in his eyes, at the steady hands that had built the fire that was keeping her alive. She made a choice. She would not be a patient. She would be a partner in her own survival. Her own hands, clumsy with cold and trembling with a deep, visceral modesty, moved to the laces at the back of her neck. She could not reach them. She turned slightly, a silent, desperate plea. He understood. His fingers, calloused and sure from skinning deer and braiding rope, moved to the delicate task. He tried to be impersonal, his touch light, but he could feel the warmth of her skin beneath the cold fabric, the fragile beat of her pulse. He worked the laces free. The moment had arrived. The dress was loose, but it still covered her. It was her turn now. She had to make the final, surrendering move. She took a shuddering breath and gathered the heavy fabric. His hands trembled as the Virgin untied her dress. She did not look at him, her gaze fixed on the fire, a hot blush staining her pale cheeks. She pulled the woolen garment down over her shoulder, exposing the white linen of her chemise beneath, now stained dark with blood. The cloth was stuck fast to the wound. Even that would have to go. Her fingers fumbled with the simple ribbon tie. "God help me," the Lakota moaned. The prayer was a choked whisper, a raw sound torn from the deepest part of his soul. It was not a plea against temptation. It was a cry for worthiness. He was overwhelmed by the sacred, terrifying weight of her trust. She was offering him a vulnerability more profound than he had ever known, and he was terrified of being clumsy, of causing her more pain, of dishonoring the sheer, simple courage of her act. He was begging Wakang for steady hands, for a healer's touch, for the strength to be the man this moment required him to be. Evelyn heard his prayer. She looked up and saw not a savage, not a threat, but a man in awe, a man humbled by her trust. In that instant, her own shame dissolved, replaced by a strange and powerful sense of peace. She was no longer just Evelyn Hart, the teacher from Philadelphia. She was a woman fighting for her life, and he was the man who was fighting with her. She finished untying the chemise and, with a final, steadying breath, eased the cloth away from her skin. The firelight fell upon the wound, a raw, angry furrow across the delicate line of her collarbone. Chaska forced himself to become a healer. He packed clean snow into a small leather pouch and used it to gently, painstakingly clean the wound, his touch as light as a feather. She flinched, biting her lip to keep from crying out, but she did not pull away. The past that had shaped her, a world of rules and restraints, felt 1,000,000 miles away. That girl would never have survived this. She was afraid that girl was a ghost, a fragile creature who had no place in this land of rock and ice. But as Chaska worked, a new strength, born of this very land, filled her. Chaska was at war with himself. He focused on the task, on the practicalities of cleaning and bandaging. But he was intensely aware of her, of the scent of her skin, of the soft curve of her shoulder, of the absolute trust she had placed in him. A bond was forging between them in the firelight, stronger than any rope, more dangerous than any blizzard. To care for this woman, to feel this fierce, protective surge in his heart, was to invite a catastrophe. It would pull him from his duty, make him a target, and endanger his people. Love, for a man like him, with a woman like her, was a path to annihilation. He fought the feeling, trying to bury it under a cold wall of duty. When the wound was clean, He took the pouch of herbs Anpo had given him. He crushed a few dried leaves in his palm and mixed them with a little melted snow to make a poultice, which he gently applied. Then he took the cleanest strips of cloth from her petticoat and fashioned a secure, sterile bandage. His work was done. He gently pulled the dress back up over her shoulder, preserving her modesty. He covered her with his heavy buffalo robe, tucking it around her. The immediate crisis was over. The silence that fell was different now, filled with the things they had not said. The storm still raged outside, but inside the small cave, the world had been remade. He sat across the fire from her, watching her face. Her eyes were closed, but she was not asleep. The firelight softened the lines of pain around her mouth. "You must rest," he said softly. Her eyes opened. They were clear, the fog of pain replaced by a deep, quiet intensity. "Thank you, Chaska." The words were simple, but they held the weight of everything that had passed between them. Her trust, his care, their shared survival. He simply nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his own throat. He knew, and he knew that she knew, that something irreversible had happened in this cave. This was no longer just an alliance of convenience. They were bound together now. He reached into his pack and took out her journal, which had fallen when he carried her in. He checked to make sure it was still dry and safe, then placed it beside her. "The confession," she whispered, her hand touching the oilcloth cover. "It is our only weapon." "We will get it to the priest," he said. It was a promise, together. She met his gaze, and in that look, everything was acknowledged. The fear, the hope, the impossible gulf between their worlds, and the fragile, powerful bridge they had just built across it. He watched as her breathing deepened, her body finally surrendering to an exhausted sleep under the warmth of his robe. He added another log to the fire, the flames leaping up to fight the darkness, and settled in to keep watch through the long, stormy night. The journey back to Red Bluff was a slow, arduous pilgrimage of purpose. The blizzard had passed, leaving the world scoured and silent, a blank page on which they meant to write the truth. They did not take their prisoner. Ames with them. Chaska had left him, securely bound and with enough food and water for 2 days, in a hidden shelter known only to him. The man's written confession, signed with a shaking hand and witnessed by both Chaska and Evelyn, was a far more potent and portable weapon than the man himself. They met Father Malloy at a prearranged rendezvous in the foothills, a lonely shepherd's cross he had erected years before. The old priest's face was a study in fear and hope when he saw them emerge from the snow-laden pines. He listened to their story, his eyes widening at the mention of the copper, his hand trembling as he held the pages of Evelyn's journal containing the confession. At Chaska's request, the priest had sent a message to the winter camp, and so it was that on the 3rd morning, as they looked out over the valley that held Red Bluff, they were joined by another figure, Elder Redleaf, his face a testament to 100 winters, his presence a silent embodiment of the land itself, had come to stand with them. He brought no warriors, only the immense weight of his moral authority. Their entrance into town was not quiet this time. They walked 4 abreast down the center of the muddy street. Chaska, tall and watchful, his Winchester held loosely in his hands. Evelyn, her arm in a sling, her face pale but resolute, her journal clutched in her good hand. Father Malloy, his black cassock a stark symbol of faith against the town's raw greed, and Redleaf, whose calm, dignified pace was in itself a rebuke to the frantic, violent energy of the place. The town stopped. Hammers fell silent. The whine of the sawmill ceased. Men poured out of the saloon and the general store, their faces a mixture of shock, anger, and fear. Marshal Pike, with Cole Maddox a step behind him, met them in the open square, a space still dominated by the empty gallows. "This is a provocation," Pike snarled, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "I ordered you out of this town, and you bring him." He jerked his chin toward Redleaf. "You are inciting a riot." "We have come to speak the truth, Marshal," Father Malloy said, his voice ringing with a strength that belied his age. Something this town is in desperate need of hearing. A crowd was gathering, their murmurs growing into a low, angry growl. They pressed in from all sides, a menacing human wall. Evelyn could feel their hatred, a palpable force that sought to suffocate her. These were the same men who had been ready to hang Chaska without a trial. Silas Boone appeared on the veranda of his hotel, observing the scene with a look of detached amusement, like a man watching a dogfight he had arranged. He had been busy. He had spread promises of work, of prosperity from the railroad, of safety from the Indian threat. He had bought their loyalty with the currency of their own hopes and fears. "We know about the attack on the wagon train," a man from the crowd shouted. "We know what they did." "You know a lie?" Evelyn's voice cut through the noise, clearer and stronger than she had thought possible. "And we have brought the proof." Pike laughed. "Proof? The word of a savage and a hysterical woman." He took a step forward, intending to seize Chaska. "You are all under arrest for disturbing the peace." But before he could move, Evelyn did something that no one, least of all Chaska, could have anticipated. She walked to the center of the square, to the base of the gallows itself. From a deep pocket in her coat, she produced the small brass school bell. Holding it high, she began to ring it. The sound was clean and sharp, a pure, piercing note that cut through the angry shouts and the ceaseless moan of the wind. It was the sound of order, of reason, of a classroom being called to session. The shouting faltered. The men in the crowd looked at each other, confused. The sound was so out of place, so unexpected, that it momentarily broke their violent trance. "This is my schoolhouse," Evelyn declared, her voice ringing in the sudden quiet. "And you are all my pupils. The lesson for today is truth." She held up the small pouch Father Malloy had given her and emptied the spent cartridges into her palm. "These were found at the site of the massacre. This one is a 45-70 government round. The other is a 44-40 Winchester. These are not Lakota weapons. These are your weapons." A murmur of disbelief went through the crowd. Chaska, meanwhile, unrolled the surveyor's map he had taken from the canyon. He held it up for all to see, the bold lines showing the railroad's intended path, a path that cut directly through the sacred burial ground. Redleaf stepped forward and pointed a long, steady finger at the place on the map where his ancestors lay. He said nothing, but his gesture was more powerful than any speech. "You have been told this is about progress," Evelyn continued, her voice gaining power with every word. "But this map shows it is about desecration. But that is still not the whole truth. It is not just about the land, it is about what lies beneath it." She held up her journal, the pages fluttering in the wind. "This is the sworn confession of one of the men hired to attack our wagon train, a Pinkerton agent named Ames. He confesses that he and his men were paid by Silas Boone to disguise themselves as Lakota warriors." A gasp went through the crowd. All eyes turned to the hotel veranda, where Boone's placid smile had finally vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "He confesses that the purpose of the attack was to create an excuse to drive the Lakota from this valley." Evelyn's voice rose, a clarion call of accusation, "because this valley contains a secret, a mountain of copper. He lied to you, he used you, and he was willing to kill innocent people, all to satisfy his own bottomless greed." The crowd was stunned into silence. They looked from the evidence in her hand to the rage on Boone's face, and the foundations of their certainty began to crumble. Some faces hardened further in denial, but others, many others, showed the first glimmerings of doubt, of a terrible, dawning shame. In that moment of fragile, hopeful connection, a few of the town's children, drawn by the commotion, slipped through the legs of their parents. They stared, wide-eyed, not at Evelyn, but at Redleaf. He was like a figure from a legend. One small girl, braver than the rest, hesitantly reached out and touched the fringe on his deerskin sleeve. Redleaf looked down at her, and the stern lines of his face softened into a gentle, grandfatherly smile. He did not pull away. For a single, breathtaking instant, a picture of a different future flickered in the center of Red Bluff, a future of healing and understanding. Silas Boone saw that image, He saw his power slipping away, his careful construction of lies collapsing under the weight of a single woman's courage. He looked past the crowd, his eyes finding Cole Maddox, who was standing near the alley beside the marshal's office. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, an order given and received. Maddox melted into the shadows. Boone needed chaos. He needed to destroy the one piece of evidence he could not talk his way out of. The prisoner. Chaska had been clever, but not clever enough. Boone knew the Pinkerton agent was being held somewhere close, and he knew Pike had a store of dynamite for the railroad crews in the warehouse directly behind his office. Just as Evelyn finished speaking, just as the seeds of truth were taking root in the hearts of the townspeople, the world exploded. A deafening roar tore the air apart. The warehouse behind the marshal's office erupted in a colossal ball of fire and splinters. The force of the blast threw people to the ground. Glass shattered up and down the street. The ground shook as if the world itself were coming to an end. A wave of suffocating heat washed over the square. Screams replaced the stunned silence. Panic, raw and absolute, seized the crowd. The fragile moment of reason was obliterated. In its place was a primal, desperate scramble for survival. The warehouse was an inferno, and the fire, fed by a sudden gust of wind, leaped with terrifying speed to the roof of the marshal's office next door. Then it jumped the alley, and the dry, wooden facade of the general store began to smoke. Red Bluff was burning. The court of public opinion was adjourned, consumed by an apocalypse of Boone's own making, in the swirling chaos of smoke and rising panic. Evelyn saw Chaska pull his rifle, his eyes not on the fire, but on the rooftops. She saw Father Malloy trying to herd the terrified children toward the safety of his stone church, and on the hotel veranda, through a momentary gap in the black smoke, she saw Silas Boone, his face illuminated by the flames of the town he had just set ablaze, a look of grim, terrible triumph in his eyes. Order was gone. The law was gone. There was only the fire and the violence that was sure to follow. The explosion was a physical blow, a fist of hot air and sound that knocked Evelyn to her knees. For a moment, the world was a roaring, red-orange blur. Chaos erupted from the stunned silence, a symphony of screams and splintering wood. The fire, born in the heart of the warehouse, was a hungry beast. It devoured the dry timber, leaped across the alley to the marshal's office, and set its teeth into the general store. The neat, false-fronted buildings of Red Bluff were turning into a line of funeral pyres. A new terror was added to the roar of the flames. From inside the burning general store came a sharp, percussive popping, like a string of firecrackers, ammunition. The store's supply of cartridges was cooking off in the intense heat, sending stray bullets whining through the smoke-filled air. The panicked crowd, caught between the fire and the random gunfire, scattered in every direction. In the midst of the mayhem, Chaska's mind was a point of cold clarity. This was not chaos, it was a tactic. He saw Cole Maddox, a fleeting shadow against the flames, scrambling onto the low roof of the saloon. The gunman was taking the high ground, a predator seeking a vantage point from which to finish the work the fire had started. Without a word, Chaska moved, melting into the thick, swirling smoke that now covered the street. Evelyn's first thought was for the children. She saw them huddled in a terrified knot near the entrance of the stone church, with Father Malloy trying to shield them with his own frail body. Embers, carried on the wind, were landing on the church's wooden shingles. The sanctuary was becoming a trap. She ran toward them, her own pain a distant, secondary concern. "We have to get them out," she yelled to the priest over the din. "The roof will catch." As she spoke, a deep, groaning crack echoed from within the church. A main support beam, its end ignited by the fire next door, had given way. The front wall of the church sagged, and a section of the roof collapsed inward with a sound of grinding stone and snapping timber. Father Malloy, who had been pushing the last child clear of the doorway, was caught by the falling debris. He went down with a choked cry, a heavy piece of the roof pinning his legs. Evelyn, acting on pure instinct, grabbed the children and pulled them further into the square. away from the groaning, unstable structure. Then she ran back to the priest. He was conscious, his face ashen with a pain that went beyond any physical wound. His eyes were fixed on her, and they held an urgent, terrible clarity. "My child," he gasped, his breath ragged. He fumbled inside his cassock. "He will try to destroy it. The truth must live." His hand emerged, holding her journal. He pressed the small, precious book into her hands. His grip was surprisingly strong, a final, desperate transfer of responsibility. Then his eyes fluttered, and a great shudder ran through his body. He lay still. Tears streamed down Evelyn's face, freezing in the cold air. But there was no time for grief. She clutched the journal to her chest. It was no longer just a book. It was Father Malloy's life. It was the last will and testament of the truth. High above the street, the duel had begun. Chaska reached the roof of the livery stable and leaped the narrow alley to the saloon, landing silently on the smoke-slicked shingles. Cole Maddox spun around, his pistol already drawn. The world around them was a hellish landscape of fire and shadow. They were two figures balanced on the edge of the inferno. Maddox fired first, the bullet screaming past Chaska's ear. Chaska dropped to one knee, the movement fluid and natural, and his Winchester answered. The slug tore a chunk of wood from the false front near Maddox's head, showering him with splinters. There was no room for careful aiming, no time for precision. It was a fight of instinct and speed. They exchanged shots, the blasts momentarily illuminating their grim faces, the smoke from their guns mingling with the smoke from the town. Maddox, realizing he could not win at a distance against the Lakota's rifle, charged. He threw his empty pistol and drew a long, wicked-looking knife. Chaska met the charge, dropping his rifle and drawing his own blade, the one carved with the symbol of the bison. Steel rang on steel, the sound lost in the greater roar of the fire. It became a desperate, grappling dance on the steep, slippery pitch of the roof. Maddox was strong, but Chaska was faster, his balance more certain. He used Maddox's momentum against him, turning, twisting, until he had the man off balance at the roof's edge. For a split second, they were locked together, staring into each other's eyes in the firelight. Then Chaska broke the hold, and Maddox, his arms flailing, toppled backward into the night, his scream cut short by the sound of a heavy splash from the horse trough below. Chaska did not wait to see the result. His eyes scanned the chaos below, searching for Evelyn. He saw her near the ruined church, a small, determined figure herding the last of the children to safety, and then he saw Silas Boone. Boone emerged from the smoke near the lumber yard at the edge of town, his fine suit now covered in soot, his face a mask of crazed desperation. He saw Evelyn, saw the book she was clutching. He saw his ruin held in the hands of this one, unbreakable woman. He lunged and grabbed her, pulling her back toward the towering stacks of milled lumber. Marshal Pike was with him, his face slack with fear, his loyalty to Boone the only anchor he had left in a world that was burning down. Chaska dropped from the roof into a shadowed alley and ran, his moccasins silent on the hard-packed earth. He reached the lumber yard just as Boone was backing into a space between two massive piles of wood. He held Evelyn in front of him, a pistol pressed hard against her temple. "Stay back," Chaska Boone screamed, his voice cracking. "Or she dies. Everything is gone, but I will not hang." Chaska stopped. He was 20 yards away, an impossible shot with the pistol, and even with his rifle, the risk of hitting Evelyn was too great. He stood motionless, his Winchester held at his side. He looked at Evelyn's face. She was terrified, but she met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw not a plea for rescue, but a look of unwavering trust. His eyes darted around the scene. A large oil lantern hung from a rope strung between the two lumber stacks, casting a pool of swaying, yellow light on the desperate tableau. It illuminated Boone's crazed face, Evelyn's defiant one, and Pike's craven terror. Chaska let his rifle fall to the ground. He raised his empty hands, a gesture of surrender. Boone laughed, a ragged, triumphant sound. "I knew you did not have the stomach for it," he sneered. Then Chaska's hand moved, a blur of motion too fast to follow. It was not for a gun. He drew the bison knife from his belt. He did not throw it at Boone. In one smooth, powerful motion, he flung the knife upward. It spun through the air, a flash of fire-lit steel. The blade struck the thick rope holding the lantern, biting deep. For a heartbeat, the lantern held, and then the severed rope parted. The heavy lantern fell. It did not hit Boone, but it shattered on the ground at his feet, spraying burning oil in a wide circle. The flames erupted, a whoosh of fire that instantly ignited the sawdust-covered ground in the base of the lumber pile. Boone screamed in shock and terror, instinctively stumbling backward to escape the sudden wall of flame. His backward step was his last. He tripped over a loose board, his grip on Evelyn broken. He fell, not into the new fire, but onto the main pile of lumber, which was already a roaring, self-sustaining furnace. His scream was no longer human as the fire consumed him. Pike stared in horror for a single second. He looked at Chaska, at the burning pyre of his employer, and his nerve broke completely. He turned and fled, a coward vanishing into the smoke and the night. Chaska ran forward and pulled Evelyn away from the heat, holding her close. The fire roared, a great cleansing sound, and then a miracle. A cold wind swept through the yard, carrying not just smoke, but something else. Snow. First a few flakes, then a thick, driving squall. The blizzard that had been their enemy was now their salvation. It fell on the burning town, a soft, white blanket of mercy. The roar of the flames was joined by a great, rising hiss as snow met fire. They stood together in the heart of the storm, watching the fire die. Red Bluff, or what was left of it, was saved. But as the smoke cleared, Chaska could see, beyond the smoldering ruins, the distant hills where the surveyor's stake still stood, a stark and silent testament to the price of greed, a wound on the land that would not be so easily erased. The dawn broke on a landscape of purgation. The blizzard, having smothered the fire, had retreated, leaving behind a world hushed and heavy under a thick blanket of new snow. Red Bluff was a ruin, a charcoal sketch of a town half erased by white. The air was sharp with the smell of wet ash and cold pine. In the stunned, quiet aftermath, the people of the town moved like ghosts, their faces smudged with soot, their eyes holding the hollow look of those who have stared into an abyss. The fire had burned away more than buildings. It had incinerated the hateful certainties that had fueled them. In the shared ordeal of survival, the community had been stripped down to its fragile, human core. They buried their dead that morning, a small, somber gathering in the town cemetery. Father Malloy was laid to rest in the shadow of his half-ruined church, his grave marked by a simple wooden cross hastily made from a charred beam. Evelyn stood with the children he had saved, her good hand holding the small, precious journal, her bandaged shoulder a dull, constant ache. Chaska and Redleaf stood a respectful distance away, their presence a silent acknowledgement of the priest's sacrifice. There were no speeches, only the sound of shovels on frozen earth and the soft weeping of a town mourning its own soul. 2 days later, a buggy, sleek and out of place, rolled into the devastated town, escorted by 4 uniformed soldiers. A man in a dark city suit stepped out, his movements precise, his face grim. He was not a man of the frontier. He was a man of ledgers and laws, and he carried with him an air of weary but absolute authority. He introduced himself as Andrew Thompson, a federal commissioner sent from Cheyenne to investigate reports of civil unrest and irregularities concerning the railroad survey. The townspeople stared, dumbfounded. Salvation, it seemed, had come not from a gun, but from a piece of paper mailed weeks ago by a priest who had seen the storm coming long before the first flame was lit. Commissioner Thompson established his inquiry in the saloon, the one building that had been largely spared. He was methodical, patient, and impervious to the blustering and evasions of the men who had once run the town. His first witness was Evelyn Hart. She sat before him, her voice quiet but unwavering, and she told him everything. She did not merely recount the events, she presented the evidence, the cartridges, the surveyor's map. And finally, she opened her journal and read aloud the confession of the Pinkerton agent. Ames, her words, clear and precise, filled the quiet room, a meticulous indictment of Silas Boone's entire enterprise of greed. When she finished, Thompson sat in silence for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the journal. "This is a most extraordinary document, Miss Hart," he said finally. "But it is just a document. Without the man, it is only hearsay." "The man is alive," Chaska said, speaking for the first time. He had been standing by the door, a silent guardian. "I can take you to him." A small armed party was formed: Thompson, 2 of his soldiers, Chaska, and a chastened townsman who knew the territory went with them. They found Ames in the hidden shelter, cold, miserable, and terrified. When he saw the federal commissioner's insignia, his defiance crumbled completely. With no Boone to protect him and no Pike to enforce his silence, the truth came pouring out. He corroborated every word in Evelyn's journal, adding details about payments, about Boone's secret meetings with Marshal Pike, and about the vast, untapped wealth of copper that had been the true motive for every lie and every death. The net of justice tightened. A patrol was sent out to hunt for the fugitive marshal. They found him not in some heroic last stand, but hiding in the damp cellar of a burned-out homestead 10 miles from town, his swagger gone, replaced by the pathetic tremor of a cornered animal. He was brought back to Red Bluff in irons, his face a mask of disbelief that the world he had controlled so completely had turned on him so utterly. With Pike in custody and Ames's full confession on the record, Commissioner Thompson summoned the regional director of the railroad, a man who arrived looking harried and deeply concerned. In the saloon, with Redleaf present to represent his people, the final pieces of justice were put into place. The railroad, faced with a federal investigation and a massive scandal involving fraud and murder, quickly disavowed all of Boone's actions. The original survey, they declared, was null and void. A new route, miles to the south and well away from the Sacred Valley, was officially commissioned. Then came the matter of the land itself. Thompson, a man of the letter of the law, had no official power to create a reservation, but he was also a pragmatic man who understood that a lasting peace was more valuable than a contested treaty. He presided over a meeting between Redleaf and a newly formed town council. Evelyn was there to translate, her voice the bridge between two worlds. Redleaf did not speak of ownership or of rights. He spoke of memory. He described the generations of his people who were buried in that valley, whose spirits still walked the land. It was not a place to be owned, he explained, but a place to be honored. Moved by his quiet dignity and shamed by the destructive avarice that had brought them to ruin, the town council agreed. They drafted a formal, binding community accord. The Valley of the Ancestors would be set aside, a protected place, off limits to all settlement, mining, or railroad construction. It was a rare, almost unprecedented act, a moment of sanity and grace born from the ashes of a terrible fire. In the weeks that followed, as the spring thaw began to melt the snow, a new kind of energy took hold in Red Bluff. It was the energy of rebuilding, not just of structures, but of a community. The railroad, as a gesture of goodwill, provided lumber and supplies. The townspeople worked together, their shared labor a form of penance and of hope. Evelyn found her purpose renewed and clarified. Her dream of a simple schoolhouse had been too small. The town needed more. With funds provided by the Commissioner's Office for Community Reconstruction and with the help of willing hands from both the town and from Chaska's people, a new building began to rise. It was built of stone from the creek and sturdy pine from the hills. It was not just a school. One side was a classroom, with a new blackboard and benches for the children who had survived the fire. The other side was a small clinic, with clean cots and shelves for the herbs and bandages she knew how to use. It would serve everyone, settler and Lakota alike, a place of healing for the body and the mind. Chaska found a new role for himself as well. He did not abandon his identity, he expanded it. He spent time in the town, a trusted voice in the ongoing work of building the peace. He taught the white settlers which plants were medicine and which were poison, how to read the signs of the weather, how to live with the land instead of just on it. But he always returned to the winter camp, to his family, to the comforting rhythm of the drum and the old stories. He was the man who walked between worlds, ensuring that the fragile bridge between them did not collapse. One clear spring morning, a group of men from the town rode out to the Valley of the Ancestors. Chaska and Evelyn went with them. They did not carry rifles or axes. They carried shovels and crowbars. Systematically, they moved along the path of the old survey, and one by one, they pulled Silas Boone's painted wooden stakes from the thawing earth. They piled them up, a monument to a dead dream of greed. A month later, on a day bright with the promise of summer, the school bell rang for the first time over Red Bluff. Its clear, hopeful sound echoed across the greening hills. The children of the town, scrubbed and eager, filed into the new schoolhouse from a nearby hill. Chaska listened, a quiet smile touching his lips. Later that day, at a memorial held in the town square for all who had been lost, the sound of his hand drum joined the quiet murmur of the crowd, a heartbeat of remembrance for a peace that had been so dearly bought. The late summer sun warmed the stones of the rebuilt church, and the wind that swept down from the hills carried the sweet scent of curing hay and wild sage. It was a season of harvest, of gathering in, a time of quiet accounting for the fruits of a hard-fought peace. Inside the small church, the air was cool and smelled of new pine and beeswax. The benches were filled, not with one community, but with two. The people of Red Bluff, in their Sunday best, sat beside the Lakota families who had come down from the winter camp, their colorful blankets a vibrant thread in the town's somber fabric. At the front of the church, before the simple altar, stood Evelyn and Chaska. She wore a simple dress of blue calico, her hair braided with wildflowers. He wore his finest buckskins, decorated with the quill work of his mother's people. They were not just a man and a woman. They were a living symbol of the fragile, precious peace they had helped to build. They had already been joined in the Lakota way, 2 days before, in the hidden valley. Redleaf had performed the simple ceremony of the blanket. He had draped a single, beautifully painted bison robe over their shoulders, uniting them as one family in the eyes of the Creator and their ancestors. He had spoken not of ownership, but of partnership, of two strong trees whose roots would grow together, making them stronger than either could be alone. Ampo had wept quiet tears of joy, and Maddo, the young warrior whose heart had been so full of hate, had stood in the circle of witnesses and given a slow, respectful nod. His healing, and the healing of his people, had begun. Now, they stood in the white man's church. The new minister, a young, earnest man sent to replace the fallen Father Malloy, spoke of faith and of forgiveness. He spoke of two people from different worlds finding a common ground in courage and in love. To many, such a union would have been unthinkable a year ago. Now, it felt not just possible, but necessary. It was the final, hopeful brick in the new foundation of the town. After the ceremony, the entire town gathered in the square for a feast. The women of Red Bluff had baked bread and pies, and Ampo and the other Lakota women had roasted a bison over a great open pit. There was no separation, no suspicious glances. The children of both peoples played a wild, laughing game of tag among the tables, their shouts a language that needed no translation. Redleaf sat in a place of honor, sharing a pipe with the town's new mayor, their quiet conversation a testament to the profound changes that had taken root in the soil of Red Bluff. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the plains, Evelyn and Chaska slipped away from the celebration. They walked hand in hand out of the town toward the low hills that cradled the valley. They did not speak. Theirs was a love that had been forged not in whispered endearments, but in the crucible of shared danger, in the silent language of trust, in the simple, profound act of caring for a wound in a firelit cave. They stopped on a small rise that overlooked the entire valley. Below them, the lights of Red Bluff were beginning to glow, small, hopeful sparks in the vast twilight. In the distance, they could see the dark, protected silhouette of the Valley of the Ancestors. The land was quiet, at peace. Evelyn thought of the woman she had been, the one who had arrived with a trunk of books and a head full of naive ideals. That woman was a stranger to her now. She had learned that courage was not an idea, but an action. She had discovered that justice was not something granted by a court, but something that had to be fought for, bled for, and sometimes died for. She had come west to start a new life, and she had, in a way she could never have imagined. She had found her purpose, not in a building, but in the building of a bridge, and she had found her home, not on a map, but in the heart of the man who stood beside her. Chaska looked at the land, his land. He had fought to protect it, not with the warrior's rage that had consumed so many of his generation, but with his mother's belief in the power of a different kind of strength. He had dared to trust, and in doing so, he had saved more than just the graves of his ancestors. He had saved a future for his people, a future where they might live in peace, not as ghosts in their own land, but as partners in its keeping. He looked at Evelyn, at the quiet strength in her face, and he knew that his own future, his own heart, was inextricably bound with hers. He had not lost his identity by loving her. He had discovered a deeper, truer part of it. As the last sliver of the sun vanished and the first stars pricked the deep purple canopy of the sky, a movement on the far horizon caught their eye. It was a dark, flowing river, a shadow moving against the dying light, a herd of bison. They were not the endless, thundering herds of the old days, but a small remnant band, a ghost of what had been. Yet they were alive. They were survivors. They were moving with a timeless, unhurried grace across the plains, a promise that life, in its fierce, indomitable way, endured. Evelyn reached into the pocket of her dress and took out the small brass bell. Its ringing had once called a town to a lesson in truth. Now, she shook it gently, its clear, soft chime a quiet note of hope in the vast stillness. Chaska, hearing the sound, smiled. From the pouch at his side, he took out his small hand drum. He began to tap it, not with the hard, driving beat of the war dance, but with the slow, steady rhythm of a resting heart. The two sounds mingled in the cool night air, the clear, bright note of the bell, a sound of new beginnings, of reason and of hope, and the deep, resonant beat of the drum, a sound of ancient memory, of resilience, and of the enduring spirit of the land. The two sounds, one from her world, one from his, did not clash. They complemented each other, weaving together to create a new song, a quiet hymn for the healing of a town, for the love of two people, and for the enduring peace of the wide, starlit prairie. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments below to connect with our community. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help us share more stories like this with the world.